Listen! DSSF
Hi everyone. It's been a bit of time, hasn't it? I hope everyone's doing well. It's taken a while, but we finally have a new Super NES music making tool. It was no secret a few years ago that I was working on a Kontakt library with original samples to make music sound more like the SNES. I wasn't too content with the current tools and libraries on the market at the time for making things sound like that iconic 16-bit Nintendo sound, so I was putting together my own. Well, while I was hard at work attempting to further my knowledge in Kontakt scripting and failing, I was contacted by somebody named David Vian, who's a partnered founder of Plogue Art and Technology, a Quebec-based VST company that specializes in making tools for making retro music. I decided to put my plans of an SNES library on hold and worked with them. 3 years later, we're finally here. I've been beta testing chipsynth SFC for the past year. Like C700, it's a VST that emulates its output to achieve the most accurate SNES sound. Unlike C700, which uses public emulation techniques, Plogue's emulation is in-house, developed with an extreme obsession for accuracy. Watching firsthand the attempt to be completely bit accurate, I've seen Plogue working with people like the fellow who started MD Fourier, which is a tool to analyze the frequency response and/or sample rate of a console. He's also been doing timed controlled phase cancellation tests to make sure that the sound output in the VST is exactly the same sound that you would hear coming out of the actual hardware, keeping in mind that every SNES has a slightly different sample rate. I'm very sure I've oversimplified their extremely complicated process, but please check out Plogue's YouTube channel, where they'll go through the technical journey required to achieve such accuracy. The link will be down in the description below. That being said, my desire to put out my own Kontakt library has been put on indefinite hold, and I've actually helped contribute a lot to this VST, such as original samples, presets, workflow ideas, and I actually helped design the US SNES skin. With all of that being said, I'm extremely excited to finally be able to show this off. And here it is. This VST is extremely powerful. It's as if someone took an SNES and turned it into a sample-based digital synthesizer. It's got multiple modes that treat it like a synth or treat it like a multi-timbral instrument such as C700. It even has its very own bit-accurate SPC player. More on that later. And unfortunately, no, at this time there is currently no planned hardware output logging to the SPC file format or a ROM file. Chipsynth SFC is designed as a VST for musicians to make SNES-style music via their digital audio workstation, not off real hardware. While I agree it'd be a cool feature to have in the future, that's not currently the focus of the software. I'll be producing a series of videos on how to do things in this VST, because with any new tool there's going to be a slight learning curve. There was also a reason back in the 90s why all these musicians and programmers said that the SPC-700 was so hard to make music for and program for. It's actually very noisy. This tool is designed to make it easier, however it does comply with most of the SNES limitations, and I'll get into where it deviates later on. This video will talk about what the VST can do. I'm not very good at playing keyboard, so I won't play a lot of live demos, but I will show you a couple songs. Also keep in mind that all the SNES music you're hearing in the background of this video have either been designed with this VST or played back from the SPC player within it. So sit back, grab a drink or a snack, relax, and let's go through these tabs. This will likely be a very long video. Okay, let's start at the top. In the settings window, you can set the pitch bend range for the pitch wheel below. You can also configure whether or not the velocity should affect the played note's volume. You can set the size of the VST, or you can even change the skin from the Japanese or PAL region skin to the North American equivalent. If you're feeling cheeky, you can even set it to look yellowed. There's other advanced settings in here, like setting your global tuning or change the set tuning to a Scala scale file, which can be found online. A Scala file is kind of like a tuning configuration file which lets you set custom tuning to other tuning standards. The filtering option is extremely interesting as when enabled, it will filter the high end of your output to make the audio sound like it's coming out of an actual SNES. This is all modeled after an MD Fourier's readings. Preset. There are a huge variety of presets, some of which I even designed. If you have a particular way you have chipsynth SFC set up that you want to keep forever, then all you have to do is click the Save as Default selection. MIDI mode is an extremely important mode. The two modes I'll go over most is monotimbral and polytimbral. MPE stands for MIDI Polyphonic Expression. It requires a special controller that allows you to control things like expression, pitch bend, and other things all on a per note basis. I don't have one of these controllers, so I cannot demonstrate this mode. Mono mode. This is the traditional chipsynth method of doing things. Each SNES channel acts as a layer, and when it's enabled, a note will play on all of the layers at the same time, with the sample assigned to that layer. We'll get into how to assign samples later, but this is a really cool thing though. It's similar to how you can layer sounds in sound fonts to make it sound more rich. Poly mode. This is the mode C700 users will probably understand the most. It allows you to direct your MIDI channels to a specific SNES channel. Remember to enable the SNES channels you want to use in the Channels tab. In polytimbral mode, you can treat the layers like actual SNES channels. Keep in mind that to keep true to how the SNES did things, you usually can only have one voice per channel. However, this is not a limitation of this VST. Polyphony is not an issue here as there are 8 cores of 8 SNES channels, which gives you up to 64 voices of polyphony. Polytimbral mode can be pretty noisy when you set it to one voice, so I'll have a separate video explaining it later. Speaking of polyphony voice control, segue time! Poly. This is how you can assign to chipsynth how many notes you want to be able to play at once. If you set it to 1, you set all the layers to be only able to output one note at a time. This also enables slurring or legato when you try to play more than one note in one channel. The effect was famous in Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII. Interpolation is a method of softening up low-quality sound playback to be less sharp to the ears. For a more technical explanation, I suggest Google searching sound interpolation. Here are some examples of what chipsynth SFC uses. Nearest neighbor is no interpolation. Choosing this will make the low-quality samples sound scratchy and almost like a Game Boy Advance or a Sega CD PCM channel. Maybe even like the Amiga back in the day. Linear is a low CPU setting that sounds okay. The higher pitches come through a little clearer, but the low end still has a bit of harshness to it. Cubic. Like linear, it softens the sound. The higher pitches are crisp with this setting, and the low end is a bit more cleaned up. Native. This is a Gaussian interpolation that the actual SNES used. The problem with this mode is that even though it's the most accurate sound if you're wanting to have a hardware-style playback, it's also a bit muddy. The low end is not as harsh, but if your sample is low quality, your high end will be muffled as well. This is probably why some games and voices on the SNES had a bad reputation of being muffled. Then of course you have the main volume knob. The small text over here says ARAM. ARAM is the main audio memory that the SNES uses to be able to load things such as samples, sound effects, music sequence data, and echo. You usually only had up to 64K of RAM to work with. While this gauge does tell you how close you are to reaching 64K in terms of your echo and sample data, keep in mind that you can go well over the SNES's regular ARAM limitations. Samples tab. This is the default tab because the first thing you're going to need to do is import sounds. You can load up to 16 sounds per instance of chipsynth SFC. If you need more, you can always just load another VST instance. To load a sample, you can select from the chipsynth SFC-Sound library on the right that automatically gets installed with the VST. The alternative is if you have your own samples in WAV, AIFF, BRR, or any other supported sample formats, you can set your user folder here and then import your own looped or one-shot sounds. You can select each sample and it'll update the waveform display on the left, or if you hover to the right of the selection of the sample, there will be an X for removing it if you want to delete it. Be careful not to accidentally clear your sample list if you're removing sample A though. You can also drag samples over top of other samples, but be wary, this won't swap them. What it'll do is actually drag over top of the other one and delete the one that you're dragging to, so you'll have to be very careful of that as well. Samples are loaded non-destructively. That means you can make adjustments and modify the sounds in multiple ways with the settings below, and it doesn't destroy your original sample. Once loaded, you'll have the option of setting the start and end positions of your sample with these rails right here. You'll also have the option of setting the SNES's hardware ADSR. Keep in mind though that these settings are default for the sample, but if you use the ADSR in the Channels tab, that will override these settings. We'll talk about that later in the Channels tab section. Pre-E means pre-emphasis. It's the method for applying a slight high shelf filter to your samples, which combats the muffleness of the Gaussian interpolation that we talked about before. Decim means decimate. It's a fancy word for resampling. The SNES has a limited playback pitch range of 128 kHz. Chipsynth SFC will automatically show a disabled color for the keys that are playing that go beyond the sample rate, but will still let you play them. If you've got a higher sample quality, you'll need to use this option if your sample isn't reaching the pitch you're trying to reach. Decimating something can work as an alternate to low-pass filtering as well, but it's really just resampling the sound to be lower quality. Norm is volume normalization. It loudens the sample to its max amplitude before digital distortion. Gain is a manual amplitude volume knob that amplifies the sample non-destructively. Tuning can be done in multiple ways. You can set it to file, which uses the sample rate that the sound file is saved with, and keep in mind that BRRs don't have metadata, so this will likely just use the automatic setting. Auto uses the automatic tuning to C4, the best its internal algorithm can do. Sometimes it's not very good because there are some sounds that have harmonic frequencies in it that just confuse the algorithm. Custom allows you to set your own sample rate for it as well. The adjust knob is a fine-tune knob that allows you to manually adjust the tuning of your sample up to 1200 cents in a positive or a minus direction. The loop option tells the sample that it should infinitely use a forward loop for that sound. In and out will tell chipsynth which sample number in the waveform to start the loop and where to stop it. These values are editable with the highlight on the display waveform, but I suggest typing in the values manually. You can also import samples that have loop points embedded in them automatically. The SNES typically could only ever loop every 16 samples. This made looping sounds back in the 90s a nightmare. Hell, even using SNES mod can be a lesson in frustration, just trying to make your samples loop without going out of tune or clicking. Chipsynth SFC will automatically resample the sound so that it conforms to that 16 sample limitation. In the event that you can't loop seamlessly, there's a crossfade option that lets you use fades between loops so that you can try to loop your sample without any clicks and pops. Auto assign is a function that tells the sample to automatically assign itself to the indicated channel number or to all the channels if you have it set that way. If you're using polytimbral mode, my suggestion is to shut this off. That about does it for the samples tab. Here's the channels tab. You'll arguably be working in this tab the most whether you're using monotimbral or polytimbral. Here you'll be able to set parameters for each channel or layer of the VST. You can also set the SNES echo settings below. It looks intimidating, but let's go through it. First thing you'll see here is which channels you're working with. Keep in mind that no sound will come out of the channel unless it's enabled. Sample column will allow you to select one of 16 samples you have loaded in the Samples tab. You can also assign samples by using MIDI patch settings in your MIDI sequencer. Remember that some sequencers like Cakewalk will not allow you to change patch unless you use the VST2 version of the plugin. More advanced users will also be able to automate their sample changes through their sequencer's automation or automation set through the matrix menu, which we'll touch on later. The amp ADSR settings, this allows you to set the attack, decay, sustain, and second decay of the sound. Release will allow the note to fade out and linger when your note is released. If your poly is set to 1, it'll still release the note, but it'll cut off when the new note plays. Noise turns on the hardware-generated noise function for that channel. The noise clock is assigned globally, so despite the fact that Chipsynth SFC has 8 SPC cores playing back audio, which means it can have 8 noise clocks to have 8 different pitches of the noise, it globally sets the noise to the same setting on all of them. What this means is if you have one channel with a lower noise pitch and another channel with a higher noise pitch, it won't matter, both channels will have the same pitch. It can also act a bit weird. If you do have noise enabled on multiple channels and you want to set a fixed pitch for one of those channels, a higher channel number will always take priority over the pitch control, even if the channel is disabled. You'll probably want to experiment with this to get its full use. FM or frequency modulation is the pitch modulation feature of the SNES. I went over it in my C700 video, but to talk about it again, it basically takes the waveform of the audio from the channel before it and modulates the channel that you have it set on with the amplitude of the waveform from that first channel. I'll get into how to use this feature in a separate video. Echo enables the echo for the sound for that channel. The echo settings below allow you to save your settings in a separate preset. You can check SNES Music episode 1 in this series for a full explanation on how the echo works. But needless to say, this is where the heart of the SNES sound comes from. Note that echo has been given its own memory, so it won't interfere with your sample's RAM, but it still is counted in the overall ARAM gauge at the top. The phase button below brings up a window that allows you to invert the phase for the echo's filter or the various outputs of the echo. INV, L, and R are phase inverters. If you have a standing wave that might sound a bit loud in a channel, you can invert the phase to see if that will help the frequency not stick out as much, though inverting one phase but not the other can cause your sound to go into a surround mode. This can make some cool effects, but as soon as you sum your audio down to a single channel mono, the channel's audio will phase cancel and you won't be able to hear its output. Surround effects do have their disadvantages. Retrig will only display when you have your poly set to 1. This shuts off legato/slurring mode and will retrigger the sample when you have a new note playing in the same channel, even if your old note is still held. Delay slows the playback of the starting of the note while the key is held. This can give you some cool sequenced echo effects, but the delayed note will stop as soon as the key is lifted. Fixed will play the same note on every key, which can be set with the chorus. Segue time. Chorus sets the default note of the channel. This is a quick and easy way to transpose the note in the song if your sequencer doesn't have a way to do it for some reason. Fine is a fine-tune setting that sets the sense of the tuning of the channel. You can adjust it plus or minus 100 cents. The volume setting sets the channel volume. While you can set volume phase to this knob using MIDI controller automation in the matrix menu or sequencer, keep in mind that slow fade-ins will likely sound bad because the SPC-700 had a very small dynamic range for the left and right output channel. The SPC-700 also didn't have integrated panning, as it used the volume for the left and right speakers with the values offset to fake it, which means if you're trying to do a smooth pan and you're at a very quiet volume, your panning may not be 100% accurate. For a good example of this, listen to Zeromus' theme from Final Fantasy IV. You'll hear it in the trumpet echoes. The glide knob is a portamento command. It slides the pitch from the first note you play to the next note that you play. To trigger it, you just hold the note and then play the next note. Low and high key. This is a function that limits the channel from not being able to play sounds past a certain set key range. This is good for drum kits, which I'll show you how to do in a separate video later on. That'll about do it for the channels tab, but the next tab is going to get very complicated. Let's go through it briefly though. The matrix menu. This is where you would set up your continuous controllers or other automatic modulation. Note, if you're using polytimbral mode, it's suggested that you use the polytimbral preset that I contributed to the presets that came with the release, because unless you set it up, you will not be able to use panning or volume controllers in a MIDI sequencer. What is set up by default is vibrato. As you can see, step 1 controlled by continuous controller 1 will affect the voice's detune depth at 100% of the range of the step modulator. It's set to offset the default pitch. This is telling us that chipsynth SFC will have a vibrato command happen if someone turns the value on the mod wheel or continuous controller 1 up. This is a bit confusing, so let's go through the columns. The source column is basically what you're doing that will trigger the effect. So for example, by default, the vibrato is always modulating based on the first step in the steps tab, which we'll talk about later in this video. The function column has nothing happening in this example, but you can basically affect the math of which how much the source is affecting the automation. If, for example, though you want to change samples depending on a value of the note velocity, you can affect the curve of the values by selecting different mathematical functions by either steepening the curve or inverting it. You'd probably want to turn down the velocity sensitivity in the settings tab not to affect the volume of the sample. A step's depth isn't affected this way, but you can set it in the range, which we'll get to. The control column is a secondary method of controlling the sound, so by default, if the secondary method has a value of 0, the primary method will not work. So for example, in the first source, step 1 is constantly modulating the pitch. But because the control, or CC1, is currently set to 0, nothing's happening. As soon as you start raising it, step 1's depth will begin to be affected by how deep you set CC1. The second function column is the same as the first, except it affects the values under the control column. Destination is what you want to affect. The vibrato is affecting the voice's detune, which in monotimbral mode will affect all layers. In polytimbral mode, the destinations under the voice menu only affect the destination functions that are controlled by the SNES channel that corresponds to the MIDI channel that you tell it to. For example, if a modulation effect on CC1 is set in channel 3 of your sequence in polytimbral mode, the vibrato in that channel will only be affected. There are other functions per channel that I implore you to play around with, as this essentially is what makes chipsynth SFC so powerful. Range is how deep you want to set the effect you're currently editing. This is where you can set the max step depth if you would like. If you're also setting parameters that have negative values, you can also set the range to a negative value. For example, if you're trying to set some kind of a panning effect, you'll want to be able to pan it to the left speaker, and the only way to do that is to have a negative value. Invert lets you set the depth of everything you set on this row backwards. For example, reversing the velocity sensitivity to make softer notes play louder. The math column allows you to change how the effect affects the parameters of the channel. You can have it replace your default settings, or you can have it set to offset, which means it'll just add or subtract onto the current value of the parameter instead of changing it. Scaled is a mode typically used for volume type settings. You can also add a row by clicking the plus sign or the add modulation button at the bottom. If you're wanting to start over, you can click the delete all button. There's no warning, so be careful not to accidentally click this. I would suggest saving your presets very often. And with that, let's go check out the Steps tab. Where the Matrix tab was the heart of the advanced effects of the VST, the Steps tab is the soul of the modulation possibilities. Here you can set the modulation for the destinations you have set up in the Matrix menu. This uses what looks like envelope bars, which are called steps. The type of step bars shown depends on the destination you set in the Matrix tab. The detune or pitch function has positive and negatives, so this envelope for the vibrato modulator is bipolar. In other words, you can use it positively or negatively. You can draw the step bars in with your mouse or manually move the bar up and down with your mouse wheel. At this time, I don't know if there's an actual way to type them in. The loop function tells the step modulator how to handle the envelope, whether or not it should loop infinitely or if it should play once, etc. You can also set the start or end portions of the envelope with the range indicators here. The reset function tells it when to restart the phase of the envelope. Sync will allow you to sync the envelope to its internal timer, which is 125 beats per minute, or to your MIDI sequencer / VST host timer. The time function can be a bit hard to understand, but essentially it's the musical timing of a note. The ratio works like num:den. Num is how many steps should be playing in the den, and the den is the musical length of a note. Speed knob is a multiplier in how fast everything should be playing. So for example, this vibrato modulator doesn't work like hertz like some other VSTs. What it's telling us is that it will play one step of the envelope every 256th note, 1.63 times faster than it normally would at the tempo the MIDI sequencer has set. You might want to know why it's set up this way, but it does make sense, considering you can technically set this up somewhat like a sequencer. Did you notice how every fourth step bar is highlighted? The step dropdown tells you how many step bars should be showing in the envelope. The frames dropdown is basically another page of the envelope. The VST will only play the current frame displayed on the screen. There's also functions that allow you to modulate the steps frames, that way you can have more than one. Delay allows you to set how many steps the VST should wait before it starts playing the modulation when a note is pressed. Ramp is a gradual fade into the maximum effect. When combined, these functions can actually make an auto vibrato. So for example, you can have a trumpet automatically play a vibrato when you're playing, with only setting the mod wheel once in the channel. This is one of the features that I'm actually most excited for because I've been requesting it the entire time. Copy and paste will allow you to copy your envelope to different frames or a different step modulator. Here you're supposed to wipe your envelope out and set every step bar in that current frame to 0. Function will allow you to automatically generate a waveform, and you can set the depth of how deep you want the amplitude of the waveform to be. The left and right arrows allow you to shift the phase of the step left and right within that frame. You can also change the page you're looking at if you have a complex project that requires multiple steps up at the bar at the top right. Ooh, those are kinda crazy complicated, aren't they? I'll have to go into more detail about this in a future video. We've got one more tab to go through, and this one's actually pretty fun. The Player tab is where you can import your favorite game soundtracks and listen to chipsynth SFC's bit-accurate SPC player. If you don't know what an SPC file is, it's a music file format that plays SNES music. You can find SPC files by Google searching them. Some of the more common sites to be able to download SPC files is snesmusic.org, zofar.net, or even OC Remix has some. While it's still possible to play a single extracted SPC file just by clicking on them, it's more encouraged to actually load archives like zip or RSN, which have the entire soundtrack in them, as the skip function of the player will only work with those at the moment. Here you can also grab samples from your favorite games and import the samples into chipsynth SFC. Want to make that Final Fantasy VI remix that you've always wanted to make? Just play the SPC file, solo through the channels to find the sound you want to grab, and then grab it. If the music is playing too slow, you can also speed up the play rate of the player to make it easier to grab that sample if you want. You can also grab the echo settings in the song using the Grab Echo button, even with its filter settings. So that's about it for the overview. I'm going to have a lot of videos showing what this thing can do. It's a very complicated piece of software. And this video's gone on long enough, so I won't be able to show them all off in here, but I did want to play some songs for you. I'm very thankful to David and Plogue just in general for allowing me to help them beta test this. Thanks guys. We'll see you in the next video. What it's going to be, I haven't decided yet, but it will definitely not be as produced as this because I intend to try to get them out as soon as possible. Alright guys, thank you so much for joining me. We'll see you in the next video.
You